Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Okay, guys, I'm back again, and this is about the fourth or fifth attempt I've done to try to do this video. I'm probably going to break this one up instead of covering several different artists, because I had a bit of a, I've been on my acoustic music listening kick mainly, including a lot of classical music, because as I've mentioned in my past videos, I associate the warm weather in the summertime for some reason with acoustic instruments and a lot of classical music, so I tend to go in that direction, more so than any other time of year. And I've been listening to a lot of that lately, as well as general things that I'm finding on YouTube. And most of the stuff that I've shown, even the vinyl pulls, most of the vinyl pulls, the things that I pull out of the vinyl there, are things that I have on CD, and for the most part, they're artists and albums, for the most part, that are in a regular rotation of mine. So even though these albums are out here and I don't play them, I have almost all of the CDs of those albums. And from what I've been pulling out, being a lot of ECM artists and that type of thing, a lot of that is the things that I regularly listen to throughout any given year. And they're in some kind of constant rotation. Maybe not a specific album I might go a couple years without listening to, but, an artist like a Ralph Towner or Eberhard Weber, somebody like that, I never go long without listening to something of theirs. And there's most of the things I talked about in I think in fairly recent videos, even going back to last year, were mostly my quote-unquote bedroom stash. And that is stuff that's in there because it's my most listened to stuff, and I have a lot of albums by those artists, so I keep them close at hand. Now, that's only, a part of my music collection. And out in the living room, I've got shelves and shelves and plastic tubs full of CDs and albums that I don't listen to on that kind of constantly revolving basis. So there's things out there that I haven't listened to since I bought them. There's things out there that, I'll get into a funk every 5 years and pull out and listen to for a while, and then not again for another 5 years or whatever. And I was out there I don't know what drove me to go out there. I guess I was just looking for something different to listen to. And I just have maybe I was looking for a specific CD, I'm not sure. And, I came across some things that I knew I had, that it's like, sometimes when you just see an album that you haven't thought about, or an artist that you haven't thought about in some time, it's like, wow, I think I want to listen to that, especially in this case, because it was an artist that I have only 4 CDs by. But I thought, those are nice, those are pleasant, very easy to get into music, nothing difficult, nothing you have to listen to a half dozen times before you get it, Maybe I dismissed it as being even too pretty. And even though I liked it, it didn't get into my regular listening patterns. Maybe since the time I got them, this particular artist has been in my time frame of listening, and my cycle of listening, maybe 3 or 4 times. And that's probably over the course of 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. I'll start at the beginning, though. I bought this compilation CD, and I believe I bought it on Tower Records online, while Tower Records stores were still around. Their online store was also very, very good. And I would go there looking for clearance items, special sale items, because they had very good sales. I'm pretty sure that's where I got this one from. And I don't know if it was the cover or what that drew me in. It's one of these multi-artist compilations put out by a record label that I was not familiar with called New Earth Records. Now, New Earth is kind of around, I checked still, but it seems like most of their back catalog is deleted or only available as downloads. And I don't know, the stuff that they're putting out now, if they're putting out anything new, it seems like it's only in the download format. So I'm not really sure that the label is exactly thriving. So they seem to have very little updated information on their website. But there's this compilation that I don't know if it might have been just the cover that drew me in initially, plus knowing it was, kind of world music new age mixture. Here's an album called Rainbow Bridge with a great cover. And the cover drew me in. And it's one of those things that I started looking at because of the cover. And all it really is, and I don't buy many of these, and I don't listen to many of these. All it is a selection of tracks taken from various artists that record for the label. So it's almost like a promotional thing for the label. I know it was very cheap when I bought it, and honestly, it was probably already out of print when I bought it, which is why the price was so low. But there's only a couple artists that I heard of. The East Indian flute player Hari Prasad Chaurasa, who I have a CD from. It's probably the only artist on the label that I actually owned something by prior to this. But from him, I kind of had a feel for the direction of the label. So I don't know what made me buy it. It was probably intensely cheap, and I loved the cover. And I thought, introduce me to some new musicians. The funny thing with this, even though it's just thrown together, it's just a selection of songs taken off of the artist's albums. But it seems like at this time, and overall, pretty much this label, a lot of the musicians shared the same musical direction. And oddly enough, even though many of the musicians were German, apparently, like Deuter actually recorded a bunch of albums for this label. A lot of the music, or not, actually just about all the artists I've heard on the label, seem to get their inspiration from East Indian music. And even though they have Indian musicians on here, guys like Al Gromer Khan, who is one of the big guys that's recorded a lot of albums for them, and the guy I'm going to talk about today called Sambodhi Prem. These are German musicians, oddly enough, very heavily influenced by Indian music, and actually from what I've read of the history of several of the musicians that have recorded for the label, including a guy named Prem Joshua. I think are all pretty much German musicians that are influenced by East Indian music, that did recording and studied Indian music in India with masters of the music. And there's really no, you really don't hear any kind of German or really European influence in much of the music. Most of it, if not all of the music of the artists that I have purchased albums by from this label, though, it's not the pure traditional classical music that influenced them as much. It doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound like a Ravi Shankar or something like that. It's a bit more modern, and the recording techniques are very modern. Most of the instruments of the various groupings of musicians that I've heard that record for this label, it's almost purely acoustic music. A lot of tabla drums and that kind of percussion. Not a lot of Western drum kits, if any at all, on any of the musicians I've heard on this label. But the way that they record, all these albums sound incredible in terms of the sound quality. The way that they record the drums, for instance, sounds very modern. And even though they're playing these kind of traditional acoustic Indian percussion instruments, kind of the rhythms are a bit more in I'd say a popular vein, but they're very much geared toward a driving rhythm that's different than what you hear in traditional Indian classical music. And most of these guys use a little bit of synthesizer in the background, but unless you really sit and pay attention to it, you don't even notice it's there. But oddly enough, the records all sound very modern because the recording techniques are so modern. The drums, when there's like a bass tabla drum thing going on, it's deep. It's almost like a bass drum on a drum kit. So they got this very modern kind of production values to them. And I tell you, I love this album. I'm not a fan of multi-artist compilations that are just thrown together. This is, I can't think of another one that I actually put on and listened to all the way through. The only other, and it flowed, I guess because the musicians all follow they're apparently pretty much all in the same age range. They have the same influences. Because their music is so much in a similar direction, even these musicians have never even played with each other, the album flows nicely. Almost like occasionally you'll come across a multi-artist album where there's a theme for the album, and all the musicians appear on the album are approached to write a piece specifically for that album and that album theme. So in that case, you might get a multi-artist album that flows nicely because all the pieces are written with a concept in mind. But apart from those type of albums, which are very few and far between, I've never heard an album that was just a thrown together compilation of various artists that flowed as well as this one does. And this is one that's a go-to album for me. And I guess because it's, I've played it a lot in the past without even going to necessarily the other musicians that appear on here on the albums I have by them. But I'll tell you, this was they could have given this to me for free because the number of albums that I bought as a result of having this one album and buying this one album is incredible. I'm trying to count. I bought at least, actually I have, these are all the albums that are referenced on this thing are out of print. So there's some that I have in my wish list that I would buy if I could get my hands on them. But I have bought at least 6 or 7 of the albums that are featured on here. And that's not a bad sales record. And as a matter of fact, it introduced me to several of these artists. And I have bought albums on the New Earth record label, like this is a New Earth recording, but also other albums by the same artist on other labels. So there's one artist I bought 4 albums by, just from hearing him here, this guitarist called Sambodi Prem. Prem Joshua, no relation. Another guy that I was introduced here who's a horn player, also playing in that kind of modern mix of classical and Indian music and modern music. I bought 4 albums by. And Al Gromer Khan, who I think I heard here first, I have no less than 7 albums by. And the one album that's referenced here that there's a little sample of is an album called Monsoon Point that I very much want to get, but it's hard to get because it's out of print. Very good album. Kind of unusual because that's like an ambient album, as opposed to most of these modern East Indian things that they do. But this is a great album. If you could find a used copy of, which they're out there, just to get a taste for the music, it's really, really great. But I pulled this out, and I had it with some of the artists that have recorded for the label, trying to keep them all together. They're out in my living room that I haven't listened to for a while. And I came across albums by this guy, Sambodi Prem. Now, me showing the covers of these is almost useless because these are reissues. So, apparently on this label, this New Earth label, this guitarist, Sambodi Prem, I believe only recorded 3 albums for. All 3 of them are sampled with 1 track on here. And I bought all 3 of the albums. But they were out of print already by the time I got into it. What I found is the albums, even though they, I don't know, I guess it was a sales thing. Maybe the original albums, which all had different covers than the ones I'm going to show you, maybe they didn't sell that well. Because the reissues are still on New Earth Records, the original record label. But they're now marketed completely differently. And they're marketed as a relaxation series of kind of anti-stress music, which is unfortunate because that's not how they were created. These 3 albums by this guitarist Sambodi Prem, who I believe is also German, but has that heavy Indian influence, were not made to be anti-stress, relaxation albums. But maybe they initially didn't sell very well. And so they were all repackaged as anti-stress. They changed the titles of them. And the covers are all, they're going to look the same, but that little picture in the center changes by album. So one is called Relaxation, Body, Mind, and Spirit. Another one's called Relaxation, Anti-Stress. You see the picture is a little different in the center, but it's the same design. And this one's called Relaxation of the Heart. But it's called the Relaxation Series, which really does an injustice to the music on the album. Now, in my mind, when I hadn't listened to these in a few years, I just remember thinking, yeah, it was very nice, very pretty guitar music. But, to me, that's like damning it with faint praise because, I don't know, I would kind of consider like a lot of the Windham Hill solo acoustic guitar stuff in that field, and that was something I was never really into. I kind of followed those artists, but I only sampled and bought an album here and there because it was never 100% my thing. And I guess you could throw this in roughly, but you would, I don't know, you would, back in the old days when Windham Hill started and they were doing all this, acoustic piano and acoustic guitar albums, these wouldn't have really fit in, but they kind of come close. Oddly enough, when I first started listening to his music, and the 3 albums are very similar. They're recorded back to back, one year after the other. I think in the early '90s or late '80s, and they were all released not as an anti-stress album, which they only mention on the bottom, music by Sambodi Prem, but they were actually issued under the original titles. One was called, under Sambodi Prem's name, Sunlight Rain River. Another one was called Mirror of the Sun. And the third one was called Rose Water Moon. And to whatever extent you can hear in the background, Rose Water Moon is just the one I kind of am playing at random. And these 3 albums, they're really pretty. There's nothing, I'll say, deep about them in terms of you would put them on and say, well, gee, I don't know if I like this or not. I have to listen to this a half dozen times before I get it. And maybe because I talked about the faint praise I had for it, because I remember thinking they were pretty. Putting them on again, though, going back to them, I'm changing my opinion a little bit. Yeah, they are pretty. They probably would appeal to the guys, the people that like that early Windham Hill acoustic guitar stuff. Most of what these albums are, there's more variety than the Windham Hill stuff, because even though the acoustic guitar is the primary instrument, there's also a backing on. All 3 of the albums are very similar in direction, with really just one exception. There's really no percussion on 2 of them. And on the third one, there's some very light percussion that are something called the water drums, which are these small drums that I think you they're different sizes and they have different pitches, and there's some they're floating in water kind of thing. They kind of, what do they sound like? They sound like bongos, essentially. Very light sound. And they're actually played by Sembodi Prem on one of the albums, and the other two have almost no percussion on them at all. And if they have percussion, it's like one track by a guest musician. So it's interesting that Sembodi Prem would actually play a percussion instrument, but choose not to use it on his own recordings, except for this one. So two of the recordings, actually all three of them follow a very similar direction. There's no electric guitar, it's all acoustic guitar, very pretty, all backed by a string synthesizer type of sound. There's a lot of keyboards on certain tracks where there's occasionally a track that's maybe a keyboard drone that there's some playing over. Most of the tracks have an acoustic guitar as the primary instrument, electric keyboards in the background, a bit of a piano sounds every once in a while, but a lot of string type sounds, which are very, very nice, very effectively used. I can't think, if this guy had recorded for Windham Hill, he would have been my favorite guitarist on the label. He also uses, and the tracks have enough variation simply because there's quite a handful of guests on here. So one track on this particular album that is this the one we're listening to now? No. But anyway, this one is pretty typical. Sembodi Prem is playing guitars, keyboard. He plays a fretless bass. So there's a little bit of electric instrument in there, but the bass is not on every track. It's only appears once every few tracks. He tends to have, very rarely, a percussionist who might play some very light percussion on one track, no drums, no heavy drums. Most of his guests play wind instruments, a flute, a saxophone, a metal flute, a bamboo flute, that kind of thing. And some Indian instruments like the veena, and tambura, which is a drone instrument, soprano saxophone, that kind of thing. Most of the guests will only play on one track. That gives the album a lot of flavor. It's usually the guests that are the ones that make one track sound different from the other, because you'll have a whole bunch of tracks that are primarily guitar with the synthesizer background. Then all of a sudden you'll have a track where you hear metallic flute playing, kind of like a lead voice. And then another track where you'll have a saxophone playing like the main melody. And Sembodi Prem tends to lay back a lot and basically make the background for those guests. Very pretty stuff. One of the musicians that does appear as a guest is Prem Joshua, who's a horn player. He plays flute and saxophones, who records on his own also for the label. So the albums are good in that they don't get samey sounding of having too many tracks with just the guitar and the synthesizer background. The guests really help to make some variation there. Another one albums, there's a guest that plays the tin whistle on there, and the mandola. That kind, and the kora, the African stringed instrument. So there's a lot of variation from track to track, album to album, even though the basis is the keyboards and the acoustic guitar. No electric guitar ever. There's a tin whistle and Irish flute on a couple tracks, and I was listening to them, I was thinking, what do they remind me of? And oddly enough, they reminded me of Windham Hill, but Night Noise, the early Night Noise, the first Night Noise album, that was just the two primary musicians, the violin player and the guitarist, and then they added on, I think for the second album, like a flute player. Kind of the more sparse Night Noise music, a couple of the tracks, which had guests on playing that Irish whistle and the tin whistle kind of thing, did remind me specifically of Night Noise. So it's kind of in that realm. But then you have the fretless bass, which will come in at times, and like I said, the guest instruments that really help make it a worthwhile listening. You don't tend to get bored with it. I'm taking a look at the third album now. Most of the violin, there's a guest violin player on one of the albums on a track here and there. Somebody playing the recorder, the wind instrument. All those things tend to make them more interesting. And when I went looking for these albums years ago, the originals were out of print. But if you go to someplace like Amazon, you'll look up the albums by title, or you'll even if they're out of print, you'll sometimes see listings for them, even if there's no copies for sale. At the time that I got them, the originals, there were still maybe some new copies floating around, but these reissues under the Relaxation series were actually cheaper to get. The only thing is the covers are decent, but if you see the original covers for these albums, I would much rather have had those. Again, they kind of marketed these, I guess because they didn't sell too well, as the Relaxation series with music by Sambodi Prem, when in fact, I'm sure there's absolutely no difference from the original issuing of these albums. As a matter of fact, on the back of the CD case on all these, it says, this CD has also been released as Rosewater Moon. This CD has also been released as Sunlight Rain River. And this CD has also been released as Mirror of the Sun. So apparently they didn't do any kind of like remixing or throwing nature sounds in there or anything like that. So you have two opportunities to kind of get these, though both versions of all these albums are out of print now, unfortunately. And I have a more updated one, because like I said, those are, I believe, from the early, I think like 1990, 91, 92. I know they came each of the three of them came 1 year after the other. And in more recent years, now this is 2005, so it's not super recent, but on a completely different label that I've never heard of before called Malimba Records, found another album by Sambodi Prem, and he's recorded several. I don't know if they're on the same label, but he does a series called Reiki now. He's kind of orienting his more current albums. These albums recorded, about 10 or 15 years later after the original three. He's kind of marketing them toward like a Reiki massage thing. And he's got one called, I only have one of them. He's got one called Reiki Forest, and I think one called, I forgot what the other one is. One's called Reiki Forest. I can't remember what the other one is. There's one called Reiki, and this is Reiki Ocean. And these are long. The other albums are like in the 50 to 55 minute range, but 72 minutes long. No guests on this one. This is a bit different. There's much longer tracks on here. 72 minutes, only 6 tracks. Apparently, because there's no other musicians credited, all the music was, according to the liner in here, written, performed, and produced and mixed by Sambodi Prem. So, and so there's no guests, so there's no flutes and saxophones and that kind of thing. And apparently it's made a little bit more low-key. I don't know, kind of like more for meditation, it seems to suggest here, and massage and stuff like that. But now it is a lot more laid back. I mean, there's not even the slightest hint of percussion. I don't think there's even any like fretless bass on here. But I really like it. It's more of an ambient album. Ambient album, but there's still acoustic guitar in there. There's no electric guitar, but the synthesizers take over more. There's not really so much strumming going on like you had to a lesser extent on the original albums. There was some light strumming going on some tracks. And there's one track here which is almost 29 minutes long. So it's much more keyboard oriented, with the acoustic guitar is still there. Maybe the acoustic guitar is like playing like a single lines, almost more like somebody would be improvising in voice would do. But I like it. It's definitely much closer to the ambient genre than the earlier albums on the New Earth record label. But I like it enough that I would definitely pick up more of these. I haven't yet. He has a website by his name, which you can find just by looking up his name. And the one thing that was interesting to me is, I don't know how many of you, besides Carm, know who the, what do you call him? The mystic, I don't want to call him a cult leader, but the Osho, who is also known as Rajneesh, who was this mystic that was followed by thousands of people throughout the world, originally from India. It seems like everybody that was originally on the New Earth record label was a follower of his. And if you go onto the Sam Bodhi-Prem's website, he still mentions Osho. Now, Osho died in 1990 at the age of 58, but he still has like these meditation centers, and apparently still has a lot of followers. So, but I noticed that almost all of the original musicians that were on this New Earth record label apparently are followers of this guy Osho. And if you want an interesting read, go to the Wikipedia page and type in Osho, O-S-H-O. What will come up is Rajneesh, who was another name that Osho used, and read his background. I saw a news report on him that was very interesting, because at one time he bought 6,000 acres, I think it was, or maybe even more, 6,000 acres in, I can't remember, was it Colorado, or, let me look. He came to the United States in the early 80s, purchased in Oregon over 64,000 acres of property for $6 million, and basically created a whole city there, and was at war with a lot of the people there, who at first decided to leave him alone, but there were some very interesting things that went on during this time with all the followers and the endless development out in Oregon where this property was, and things that went on, including people in the Osho organization actually spearheading the salmonella poisoning of several apparently government officials that worked in Oregon. It was wild. He ended up getting thrown out of the country. So it was a very controversial guy, and if you have any interest in these, I kind of like, I don't know, I'd call it a cult, but I have a real interest in these, and I had seen a news report one time, and boy, and it's funny, he still has followers. He passed away in 1990. So very, very controversial practices. When he got thrown out of the United States, he tried to go to any number of countries apparently, and was thrown out of that, was not allowed to enter a lot of countries, and ended up going back to India, which he didn't want to go apparently, but that was one of the few places that would take him. Very interesting history on him. And I think this record label was originally a record label that was put together by his organization, because it's interesting to me that everybody that in the early days that recorded for this label seemed to be a follower of his. That's just a little aside note for people like me that are interested in these things. But if you type in Osho and you go to Wikipedia, you've got a whole big, long, very interesting history on there, which was stuff that I saw in a news report once. But I still like the label. I still like the music. I highly recommend this if you are interested in the slightest bit of kind of modern musicians taking that East Indian music and doing something a bit more modern with it, but not modern in a way like techno trance or something like that, but just kind of like an updating of it and making some really pretty stuff in the process. You might want to sample this, and there's a whole bunch of artists on here that you could potentially float your boat like they did to me. So as a result of just having this one album, how many CDs did I buy? I don't even know. By the artists that are on here, not all of them were on the New Earth record label. But I know I have 7 by Al Gromer Khan, 4 by Sam Bodhi-Prem, 4 by Prem Joshua, and I'm actually looking for more But I really wanted to get these early New Earth recordings by these artists. They've been out of print for years and are getting a bit harder to find. Otherwise, I would probably own every single album that they took a track off of here, which is maybe, I forget how many tracks are on here, maybe 14 tracks from 14 different albums, of which I have 5 or 6 of the actual albums already. So, I'm not quite halfway there. Okay, guys, I talked a lot. And next time I might show another artist that, as a result of me pulling this Sambodi Prem albums out by this guitarist, who I really do highly recommend these albums. I started listening to some 2 other artists that recorded for the New Earth label, and I may talk about them next time because after several days of listening to the Sambodi Prem albums, I started listening to the other 2 musicians, the other 8 or so albums that I have by the other musicians that recorded basically at the same time in like the early 90s for the New Earth record label. I'm really digging them. And oddly enough, because they're so acoustic based, yes, there's synthesizers in these. A lot of these, the synthesizers just in the background. But I just realized because these are acoustic-oriented albums, most of the instrumentation is acoustic-oriented, especially on the other artists that I haven't talked about yet. It's kind of, without me even intending it or realizing it, it's kind of fitting in with that vibe, with that summertime acoustic vibe. So I'm pulling out these albums in the last 3, 4, 5 days, giving them so many plays. Who knows? They might fall into my summertime annual acoustic listening phase. And it was totally accidental, just because I was looking in my stacks of CDs of things that I don't play that often, and I don't have on a regularly cycled basis. And as a result, got into them. So, I'll probably be doing that more. I'll probably be going out to my living room and looking more in the storage things for stuff that I haven't played as much as my mainstays, and maybe reporting on them in the future. And sorry this went so long, but that's the way it goes sometimes. Okay. I hope this had some value. I will be back soon, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well, and take it easy.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.